Now we can look at some art. Okay, technoculture. And we're going to go back to Sage again. This was a piece of vector art which was designed by some anonymous engineers that was used as kind of a test screen for these consoles that we saw these very serious guys with their light guns and their cigarettes sitting at before. This was it was actually traced from a pinup calendar, probably with one of these light guns just kind of clicking the coordinates to make the vectors that were necessary. The anonymous engineer comes up a lot in the history of early computer art because the very early computer art wasn't actually attributed to any one person. It was usually the product of a larger working environment, and usually people with no, let's say, professional artistic aspirations. This was simply a piece of folk art. This was made inside of a certain context for the amusement of people inside that context. Gustav Metzger that Darko mentioned yesterday with these kind of gigantic walls of displays that would self-destruct. He wrote in 1971 that in terms of computer art, the real avant-garde was the enemy. This is the winner of the first competition for computer art that happened in 1963, and it was not attributed to any one person. Now, we had a magazine that was supposed to be for computer art, but the first people to submit things to this computer art magazine were also laboratories. And in this case, this is the Ballistic Research Labs in Aberdeen, Maryland. And this is called Splatter Diagram, and although it looks very much like a bomb exploding, and you could certainly think of it that way, it's actually supposed to be a scientific diagram of distortion patterns in a camera lens, actually. Grant Taylor, who is a huge source for a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about tonight, one thing that he notes is that actually there's a whole hidden history in the ballistics research lab as well, because quite a few of the people involved in there that were not like the top researchers and things, but the people actually doing the physical labor and the calculating on paper and these kinds of things, were women. And actually there's a long history in computation of using women as kind of human calculators, basically, to solve equations in longhand on paper, to kind of pre-cook some of the data before you started inputting it into the computer. Obviously, we can't talk about oscilloscope graphics without talking about Lepofsky. I believe that Andrew Duff probably showed you maybe even some of these same pictures. He was working in the 1950s and the 1960s. He had a very strong math background, and he was very interested in using these kind of lab equipment things to display these very complex patterns that when you know a little bit about your math, you can start to render out. He never made any sort of motion picture things, but he made lots of photographs, and he was very interested in presenting them in an arts context rather than in an engineering context. However, these were shown in, I love this title of this magazine, Recreational Mathematics. Let's get together in the park and solve some calculus. Yes, with a little rosé perhaps, and some strawberries. We should talk about video games a little bit, because video games are also a place where the interactive technologies and simulation and prediction and control converge in a very controlled environment. So this is Tennis for Two, William Higginbotham. Here we go. We'll look at this just for a second. Watch the interface device. Here it comes. You can hear it already. I think your thumb would get pretty sore after an afternoon of tennis for twoing. Higginbotham is a really interesting character in the sense that he was working in this context in the late 1950s where so much research time and money was dedicated towards, let's say, technologies of destruction. The analog computer that he built Tennis for Two on as kind of a demo for these labs that people could come in, and he was trying to say, like, look, we can do fun things with computers, let's play tennis. That computer was normally used to simulate trajectories of things with wind resistance. So again, we have this kind of arcs of gravity and dropping bombs on people and things, I would imagine. Higginbotham is most known for this funny little thing he cranked out in a few days for this demo. However, he wants to be remembered and so I will honor that request. He wants to be remembered actually for his efforts to promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So he was going a little bit like Wiener, a bit against the flow of where the big money and the big drive in technoscience was at the time. If we talk about table tennis for two, we have to talk about SpaceWar. I'm going to have to fast forward. Whoops, damn. You didn't see that. I'll have to fast forward a little bit here. Oh, we're there already, almost. Here we go. Enough symbolic debugging. Have a look at what kind of hardware is necessary to play one video game.
The most amazing of all, it's SpaceWar from our very own Steve Russell.
We have the source code.
And actually we even have the source code of SpaceWar. It's modified for the CHM, so Steve kept working on it. So far it's all assembly, instruction by instruction, so very efficient programming.
This is all of SpaceWar.
This is all of SpaceWar.
4K.
All of, yes.
Guys, this is how everything should be programmed. Tell that to the Microsoft here.
That's right.
Oh, it actually overflows the receptacle a little bit.
Well, we've learned that if it doesn't start stacking right, just grab it with your hand to get it out of the way.
Experienced operator here. All right, 4K is the machine.
4K, and there's...
And ups, there you go. Here's SpaceWar.
Okay, that's the PDP one. That's a really common early computer. And now they're going to fly around in space and blow each other up.
Game on a digital computer ever.
Right, and then and it's such a good one. And you guys have
I'm going to fast forward a little bit and find just a bit of gameplay here. Hold on. Here we go. So this is very Vectrex looking. Actually, the first game that pops up in the Vectrex looks surprisingly like this one. This one incorporated some models of Newtonian models of gravity. There's a star in the middle of it, and you can kind of accelerate in and out of the curve of this star and throw yourself out into the outer reaches and then propel yourself back in. And this was the kind of thing that inspired people later to write some of the first video games like Space Invaders and Pac-Man and things like that. Probably Space Invaders more than anything else. And it looks surprisingly like Asteroids or Minesweeper or something like that. So again, and these are people that are working, this is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This is some of the same people that brought you the SAGE defense system. It's working in a very similar sort of context, and we're simulating not a war over the ocean. We're not simulating a war in tanks or anything like that, or with nuclear bombs. We're simulating a more imaginary war out in space. But I would say that the origins of this kind of stuff filter in very much into the kind of content that got produced. Oops. Yesterday, Darko talked a little bit about ASCII art, so I wanted to show this one as well, for a number of reasons. Also that we have two engineers who had absolutely no aspirations of being artists whatsoever until later. Trying to work with computer imaging technology. This is a piece of ASCII art. If you were able to zoom into this reclining nude, which is a very, let's say, conservative, old school way of talking about art or making art, a very classic subject matter, then you would see that these are all, I think these, here for example, we have a lot of symbols of the Zener diode. That's the one that I recognize the most here, and maybe there's little bits of Zener diode that are kind of chopped up in there or something. So, and of course, when you step back from it, you see the dancer Deborah Hay. They actually, as they would have, made this and printed it out on a plotter and hung it up in the office of a colleague as a practical joke, actually. They fed this image into the computer and they plotted it out with these ASCII characters, and they wanted to make this really embarrassing thing. What's more embarrassing than having a naked lady in your office? Oh my God. So and we can read lots of stuff into this. We can read the need to simulate, predict, and control the female gender if you would like to push it that far. But it's considered one of the classics of computer art. And in the same way that when for example, the Moog synthesizer or the theremin were created, you validated those instruments by playing Bach on them. You validated computer imaging technology by making classical treatments such as the reclining nude. Oops, see, we keep zapping forward here. Oh, there's a lot of text on that slide. Some of the stuff that I've been looking at a lot is the things that Darko was speaking about last night, new tendencies. There was a great exhibition that I visited at the beginning of the year, which was called the Other Atlantic, which talked about the connections between artists, for example, working in new tendencies in Eastern Europe, and those working in South America, for example. So very much outside the traditional centers of art, and especially of the art market. And they had very different ideas, and they had very socially utopian ideas, as Darko talked about a little bit as well. There was these ideas of the democratization of art, which we still talk about quite a bit. If somebody talks about having a laser cutter or a 3D printer, what they're talking about is a democratization of a creative process that might have required much more technical skills, or at least hand skills, in another time to realize the same sorts of projects. So they were very interested in things like this. This is Vera Molnar, Hungarian, emigrate to France, and it's a plotter drawing, and her stuff's just absolutely fantastic to me because it moves without needing to move. It doesn't need to be animated. The reason that this slide is here is to talk about a certain shift that happened in the late 60s and the early 70s, where it did become much more possible for artists not working, or for, let's say, artists in general, to have access to this kind of technology rather than simply the anonymous or semi-anonymous technician who puts, the difference between that image and this image is very telling. It's an image by some guys of a woman whose face is quite indistinct. And here you have the expression of a mind of a woman who was very much ahead of her time. We're going to skip a little bit. I think probably Andrew Duff showed you some pictures of Desmond Paul Henry, because I learned about Desmond Paul Henry from Andrew Duff. The thing on the left there is an automated drawing machine, and the thing on the right is the product of this drawing machine. This drawing machine was constructed out of the counterpart of the anti-aircraft gun, which was a bomb timing computer. So the bombardier inside the airplane that's trying to avoid this automated fire from the ground is busy trying to balance out and level all sorts of things and figure out when to drop this bomb, and how long the fuse needs to burn before it goes off, and so that it can get to where it needs to go and do the dirty work. So Desmond Paul Henry found bits of these things because after the Second World War they were already incredibly obsolete, and he started repurposing them, adding motors to turn these gears around in different ways. This machine, for every kind of account that I've read of it, was almost falling apart every time you used it. So it was also another one of these kind of Metzger-esque self-destructive things. And so the difference between this kind of stuff and Lipovsky's oscillons is that this is very jittery, it's very physical, it doesn't exist in this completely perfect world of mathematics. It exists in a world where there's mechanical difficulties and things break down, which I like very much. It gives it a completely different quality. Another repurpose of these weapons of warfare would be John and James Whitney. And I'll just try to find this little section in here where you get to see this machine in action.
Now, there's a relay here, and this is the bank of amplifiers that drive the servo motors of the system.
The computer which created the Stargate corridor in the film 2001 was developed by the man behind these glasses, John Whitney. His 3 sons and his brother James have all used his machines to make computer films. The Whitneys are not inhibited by the specter of giant computer companies. They build their own.
They're hardly to be called computers because they're really specialized problem solvers. They were computers that were designed to compute only on one kind of an equation. For many years, I had been doing straight animation using the hand-drawing techniques or primitive forms of manipulation of artwork in one way or another. Some of the things that Norman McLaren has done, in fact, I've drawn directly on film. And but it was only in the mid-50s when I began to see these devices that it became clear that there were great possibilities for developing animation machines that.
So the bits of this machine that he was showing you there came from these gun controllers that I showed you earlier, the ones that were attached to these anti-aircraft guns. And again, they were machines that were absolutely obsolete by the end of the Second World War. And he talks about literally a flood of that kind of thing being emptied, regurgitated out by the military and sent out into these kind of surplus and salvage stores, especially in Southern California. Because there's a lot of these military bases in the West out in the desert. So there was just tons of this stuff awash out there. So he bought bits and pieces of an M5 and later an M7 anti-aircraft gun directors. It's not a gin director. What was I thinking when I wrote that? Gin and tonics, here we come. And another, probably the most famous film that uses one of these gun controllers is James Whitney's Lapis. This is a really difficult film to show from YouTube. We're slaughtering it by looking at it in this sort of resolution, in this sort of compression. The procedure for making this film was to use that mechanical computer to calculate the location of hundreds and hundreds of dots, which then James hand-painted and photographed on the animation stand. So, yeah, that's one that it deserves seeing it in a film print. If you can ever catch it in a film print, you will not regret it. So, and yes, it has this very 60s sort of an experience there. One commentator wrote about this, that actually watching this film trains your eye in the same way that the gun director, operator might have to look. You're scanning a very large expanse of film in this case, or sky in the case of the gunner, and you're trying to recognize patterns. And once you recognize those patterns, you try to zoom into it and you try to predict what's going to happen next. I think it's a very interesting comparison. It's again that the typewriter in this case is coming back and affecting the brain of the operator a little bit, the brain of the gun operator and the brain of the film viewer. And the approach of his brother, approximately the same year, Permutations. The previous film, when people told me that it was a computer film, I looked at it and I was like, how is this a computer film? It doesn't look anything like the computer graphics that I know from that era. And it's a computer calculated film. This is actually a computer rendered film. It's an animation that focuses on 281 points that are being moved around in very harmonic ways on the screen by the computer. One thing to remember with all this stuff is that there's another artist that I'll show later, Manfred Moore. Manfred Moore, John and James Whitney, and many other people commented, Larry Cuba as well, that animation in this way it's an absolutely words like painful and agonizing were used, because even if you were rendering these things on a computer, it took several seconds for each frame to be displayed, and then an analog camera was triggered to photograph the screen. Then you had this run of film that then had to be sent off and developed. So there was absolutely no real-time feedback at all into the output, into the results of your labor. You just had to calculate and plug and pray that this would look the way that you predicted it. I'll let you look up the rest of these. There will be a link at the end of this for this slideshow if people want to go back and watch the whole things. One thing that happened in 1969 that was very important was the invention of the Sony Portapak, which allowed people to use video cameras outside the confines of the television studio. And that, in some ways, not to sound too technologically deterministic, launched the video art movement on the whole. I'm not going to cover a lot of video art, but I do want to talk about one particular machine, and to talk about that machine I need to talk about another machine. So we need to talk about the Scanimate, which I don't have an exact date when it was invented. It was sometime in the mid-60s, I think. And every time you see logos that look like the one I'm about to show you, where things are kind of spinning around and morphing and stuff like that through the 70s, it was probably made on a Scanimate. Okay, no, short and sweet. A Scanimate was a massive machine. It was the size of like 2 automobiles or something like that. It was a gigantic, very specialized analog computer for the manipulation of video signals. The Rudetra machine, in contrast, which was made in 1973, which several other people are going to talk about, so I'm not going to try to spend too much time on it, was an attempt at making a more democratized version of this Scanimate. Whether that succeeded or not, I'm not sure, because there's how many Rudetras in existence? 12, 13, something like that. So it didn't really take off, but it came from a completely different place, and it came from this scene of freaky people involved in artistic video. And I think in the beginning, as you'll kind of get from this demo, they were trying to kind of pitch it as a tool that might be used for kind of sane, normal stuff, but very quickly it became this kind of bizarre artistic tool. This is a very dry demonstration of what it can do.
Hi, I'm Bill Etra, and this is the Rudetra video synthesizer. The synthesizer controls the height of an image through 0.
Through 0.
The width of an image
through 0.
Through 0. The height and width of an image together to 0, which gives us a zoom. The intensity of an image to 0. The horizontal screen position of an image off the screen in both directions.
Bye.
And the vertical position of an image off the screen in both directions. And one other parameter, which we call horizontal centering. As I put an effect into the image, you can see that horizontal centering allows us to move the image through the effect. When we use these controls in combination, we are able to animate the image as we did in the polyfusion show.
So now we get a little freakier. Remember that this is just a video signal that's getting kind of wobbled around in space and things. Far out, man. So they might have been aiming at a slightly more conservative audience in there, but the works that they made themselves with these were quite a bit more radical. This is Bill Etra's work, Abstraction on a Bedsheet. We're just going to look at a second of it. In fact, I'm just going to go to the middle. So again, this is a Rudetra under control of an analog computer, PDP-11. And that image started out as a nice rectangular video raster and has been manipulated in very complex ways with harmonic signals into something quite different, actually. The sounds that you hear, I'm not sure if these are video sounds or not. They don't sound like the video sounds. They sound like something else. Maybe they have something to do with the frequencies that are being sent in from the computer. You'll see a lot more about the Rudetra in several talks during the course of this week. Jonas Bears will be talking about it, I'm sure, and Ivan Cliff Marusic will be speaking about it, I'm sure, at length. What makes it relevant, definitely, to what I'm trying to talk about here is this piece of promotional text. well, we'll just read it for a second here. It's very utopian. We get to do crazy things with video. We get to do all this stuff that's going to make your work more marketable and things like that. But here he says, emerging from the early principles of video image manipulation used for radar in the 1940s, expanded in video flight simulators of the 1950s, and in experimental video art of the 1960s. Wait, how do we get there? The Rudetra video synthesizer represents engineering and cost-saving breakthroughs. They're very aware of their history, and they're very aware of the applications of this technology in its previous contexts, let's say, which I find very interesting. This flyer for me represents the point at which video technicians, who quite a bit of them actually were ex-radar technicians as well, stopped playing war games and started dropping acid. Suddenly it was about making wild, experimental things go on there. So we're almost to the end. How are we doing for time anyway? Am I late? Yeah, I'm really late. Sorry. Okay, just a couple more things. Larry Cuba is a video artist, however, and known for some very experimental things. And Two Space, I think, is the last clip that I'm going to show. However, most of you will know him for something completely different.
Battle station is heavily shielded and carries a firepower greater than half the Starfleet. Its defenses are designed around a direct, large-scale assault. A small one-man fighter should be able to penetrate the outer defense.
Pardon me for asking, sir, but what good are snub fighters going to be against that?
Well, the Empire doesn't consider a small one-man fighter to be any threat, or they'd have a tighter defense. An analysis of
the computer display in this scene from Star Wars is actually a piece of film being reprojected onto the screen. In the tape you're about to see, I will describe how I used a real computer to animate this effect.
So Larry Cuba was called in to do, in particular, this one rather famous scene, and it's definitely one of those classics of vector art. I've seen some homages to it in some people's work already. Let's look for a second at the machine that he was using. We can look at some of the animations, but here's them constructing, basically to summarize what he says in the 2.5 minutes before this, that they built these trenches that these fighters had to fly through a number of pre-calculated units, and then they just assembled them in different ways. So here they are building the units.
The object being created appears on the screen, and a cursor indicates the current position of the pin.
So again, we go back to the sketch pad with the light pen, and there's another nice part that I like a lot. Actually, it comes really soon here. Let's see. There we go.
Separately by selecting one of the
so we kind of zoom out. We get to see some of the equipment. These are objects that are being drawn in a kind of a virtual 3D space, and then we get to kind of spin them around with these gigantic analog-looking knobs.
With the 6 basic modules stored in the computer, I wrote a program to combine these modules into larger structures. My computer version of the trench was constructed of U-shaped sections placed side by side.
So again, they've kind of created these virtual models, they've assembled them, and they've kind of virtually flown you through them a little bit. The Larry Cuba piece is not online. I have another clip of it, so I'll show it last. The thing to think about the Larry Cuba piece, Two Space, which was made a couple of years after he did the Star Wars stuff, was that he's still saying this was a really agonizing process. This wasn't done in real time, so I had no idea about the kind of the synchronicity. I couldn't actually see the rhythms that I was trying to create because the only time that I could see them was after this camera painfully photographs every rendered frame. Another artist that complains very much about the limitations of the technology of which he was working is Manfred Mohr. one of the things that is commented a lot about the difference between European and American computer art and technological art is that North American art tends to be very pragmatic, and European computer art tends to be a bit more conceptual. I wanted to put these two things next to each other. This is not my observation. This is one that was made by some other people, but that Manfred Mohr and Sol LeWitt were working essentially quite contemporary to each other, and they arrived at some of the same very interesting conclusions. Yesterday with Darko, we talked a little bit about the conceptual approach to art as being like an algorithm, a set of instructions. Do this, then do this, then do this. Go back to line 1, do this, this, and this. So these variations on incomplete open cubes is essentially a set of instructions about how to draw a cube by Sol LeWitt. And Cubic Limit, which begins with him complaining about what a painful experience it was to make it, works in a very similar sort of way. This is another one of those classics, and you definitely see homages to this as well out there. Yeah, in these really painful environments, exactly. Thankfully, actually, Cubic Limit doesn't have any sound, because sometimes the soundtracks that were chosen for these were quite also painful. So these are very algorithmic, systematic approaches towards cubes. Here we're seeing that he's removing 1, 2, 3, 4 sections of the cube until we've reduced the cube to a single line and then to nothing at all anymore. And with these lovely rotations, which are, that's what makes it 3D, is that it's spinning. Spinning cubes and teapots. Everything has to spin. It's definitely worth the time to watch the whole thing. Manfred Mohr continued to make very geometrically inspired art. He continues, he's still alive. So he continued to make very geometrically inspired art, although his more recent works are inspired by multi-dimensional. So he's working with 4, 5, 7-dimensional geometric constructions which are being flattened down to 2 dimensions. And he's tracing paths through a 7-dimensional cube. They're really fascinating works, and then some of them are rendered in like laser cut steel or things like that. So it's quite nice stuff. Oops. Darko also mentioned Robert Mallory. He talked about him in the context of laser cutting and 3D printing and things. I want to end with this before I show a couple of seconds of Larry Cuba. In 1969, Robert Mallory was feeling very... he was looking at the future. He was trying to conceptualize what it means for an artist to work with technology, and that the tools are advancing as well as the use of the tools. And so he kind of came up with these 6 levels, and some of them are a little utopian and some of them are a little bit dystopian, about how the use of computers evolves over the course of the development of the technology. And on the first level, the computer simply just does boring stuff. It just makes your life easier because it counts how many socks you put in the washer instead of you counting how many socks you put in the washer. However, at the second step, it becomes a very indispensable tool. It becomes impossible to make certain kinds of works without the assistance of that machine because our brains simply can't process that much information. On the third level, the machine can start to make autonomous decisions if you tell it what to do whenever that situation comes up. So as long as the machine is prepared to make that sort of a decision, it can make that decision for you. However, on the next level, it starts to have intelligence of its own, artificial intelligence, and it starts to be able to react to situations that it was never prepared for in the first place. I would say that we're with things, I don't know, like Google, like the Deep Dream and things like that, we're sort of hovering around in this like level 3, level 4 area with the development of artificial intelligence. At the next level, however, the machine is so advanced that actually humans are just too stupid and slow and they get in the way. However, the human still has the option of pulling the plug, which he doesn't have in the last step where the computer becomes so embedded in everything around us or so immaterial in the cloud that it's just pure disembodied energy, that it simply is just an omnipresent thing in our life. One would assume that already by level 5, the computer would no longer need us to make it either, since a machine that's incapable of completely autonomous operation would certainly be capable of engineering and reproducing itself without those pesky humans around. So we're already kind of in Terminator territory a little bit. Some of this is utopian, some of this is very dystopian. But 1969 was a really good time to think about that. There's a lot of sources here. Some of these I used more than others. I would say that if you are really interested in reading about the troubled history of computer art, that Grant Taylor's books and all of his writings are quite phenomenal. And this is the URL that if you would like to go back and look at these clips in total, or check out some of these resources a little bit more, this slideshow is publicly available. So take your snapshots now if you're interested in that. And we'll look at a couple of seconds of two-space here. Maybe we can fade down the sound. And we'll just leave that running for a second, and I'll say thank you very much for your patience and interest, and it was a pleasure to talk about things that I love nerding out to with you. Maybe we have time for a couple of questions. I don't know if anybody has anything urgent they would like to ask or say.
Derek, thank you so much for your talk. I think Jost's talk will speak about some similar things.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
it speaks to all of the things that you've already mentioned in the festival. I've been on some of these same research journeys, sometimes using your website. Derek also does stuff about drawing on film and optical sound, which also has a kind of military history. In World War I, they were recording, the range finding for guns got so good at recording sound on film that the German guns had to move because they would be found and shot at, and they have a recording of on 35mm film of the end of World War I when the guns stopped because they were recording all the data before.
Okay,
sound
I
on
didn't
film.
know that. That's
This
fascinating.
kind of thing I found in the range finding computers.
Yeah.
But my question to kick off, and then we'll maybe take two questions because we have to be quick, is I don't go looking for these technologies as military technologies and then use them. I find the technologies and then I research them. What do you do?
We live in this environment where things just kind of fall on us anyway. I don't know if I started looking at oscilloscopes and things like that as military technologies, but in this process of digging around in the cultural resonance of them, that's definitely some of the things that you find.
It interests me that I think it happens that way around, and then you want to find and be critical about the things you're using.
Yeah, this point of being a critical user, or in the case of other kinds of technologies, a critical maker, that you're not simply just accepting things on the basis of aesthetics, but you're also looking at what kind of cultural resonances they have, what sort of significances they have. And I'm not saying that by using computers or using these kind of technologies that you're subscribing to an ideology, but you have to understand that the ideology is packed in there, and it's part of the symbol that thing is. There's a lot of discussion about problematic historical objects and symbols, and I think acknowledging like the dark sides of the histories of certain kinds of technologies is an important thing.
Yeah. Okay, so we have time for two questions. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask? Yeah?
Just a very interesting notion that you used, if I understand correctly. You said that predicting the future enables control in a way.
It forecloses the possibilities. It limits the possibilities down to hopefully one.
Yeah, so what's the potency of art if actually art, I think the quality of art is to predict the future in order to anticipate any kind of cultural context that we're going to find ourselves in. So is there a potency in this prediction, or is it just like closing something that's going to become mainstream or something?
I think that's a really good and big question, of course. I think that one of the differences between using cybernetic techniques to predict, simulate, and control, and using technology in an artistic context is that in an engineering sort of a context, let's say, there's one right answer. There is the ideal solution to that problem. And in an artistic context, you want to problematize everything. You want to open up the field of possibilities rather than foreclose them. If I look at a piece of art and it tells me only one message and that there's one right message, it's another category of art, and that category of art is propaganda. And I don't find propaganda to be useful as a positive, effective art at all. Oh, we're done with Larry Cuba. I hope that in that sort of short time that kind of answers the question a little bit. Right, to open up field of possibilities rather than to close them down.
Does anyone have a last question? If not, we're going to have Bernard and then Robert play.
No, the plan has changed. There is no longer 2 performances that you're going to see this evening. It's going to be 1, and it's going to be a collaborative performance. They've decided to work together. So
that's excellent. So there's, can we have a big round of applause for Derek?
Yeah, thank you very much.